So we're just going to get started. Just for housekeeping, I just wanted to let you know it would be great if you could put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be more looking into that than into the chat. And we will be holding the questions at the end where we have a Q&A part of the session. And with that, I would like to welcome you to our third part of our OITE Mental Health and Wellbeing series for biomedical researchers. My name is Uli Klenke, and I'm the director of the OITE Resilience Programs. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Erica Shirley, an OITE Wellbeing Advisor. And really, I thank you for coming today to talk with us about this really, really important topic, the epidemic of loneliness. And we started our series with a discussion of burnout in the biomedical profession. And in our second session, we discussed how healthy rest can be an antidote to burnout and help us be creative and productive. So the one thing that we learned, and I think in both talks that came through, that an important factor for healthy rest, but also for combating burnout, is having social support and connection to others. So today we will take a deeper dive into this piece of connection and social support by looking at the current global epidemic of loneliness and how it specifically affects the biomedical research community and the ways to intervene and address this issue. Next slide, please. So we'd like to start with a definition of loneliness. Loneliness is a universal human experience that can affect anyone, regardless of our age, our gender, our social status, and all our other identities that we are bringing to the table. Generally, researchers define loneliness as a subjective feeling of social isolation. People may feel lonely when their social needs are not met by the people around them. And loneliness can have serious physical and mental health consequences. And we will get into that in a little bit later part of the talk. Next slide, please. And it is really important to distinguish loneliness from being alone. Loneliness is a very subjective experience, and it is related to the perceived quality of our social interactions rather than their quantity. Loneliness can arise from not feeling seen or not understood or validated enough in our interactions and relationships with others. However, it is important to understand that you can be surrounded by friends at a party or within your family environment and feel very lonely. But you can be perfectly content in solitude when you're alone and doing something that you love. So for example, this person on the bench, they could feel very lonely, but they could also be truly enjoying being alone, watching the scenery or whatever is playing out in front of them. And solitude and loneliness are not interchangeable, but very different states of being. Next slide, please. So how did we end up here? Many pinpoint the beginning of something like a loneliness epidemic in the 1960s, when the percentage of single households or single person households grew at a much steeper rate, and people of all ages actually started to live by themselves. And since then, the rates of people feeling lonely have increased over years and globally, resulting in that declaration of the epidemic of loneliness in, I think, 2017 or 18 by the former and current US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. And in the UK, they even appointed a minister of loneliness in that time. And then we know the following years, the pandemic started, and with its social distancing and isolation, so many more people felt lonely and alone. And so therefore, the state of loneliness has increased even more since then. So let's look at some of the recent statistics. Over 60% of adults in the US report feeling lonely. And younger generations are lonelier than ever. They're older than older generations. And so with a number of nearly 8 in 10 in the Gen Zers, which is an interesting way of calling or saying that particular term, and 7 in 10 millennials being lonely compared to only half of the baby boomers feel in terms of generation. That makes a very U-shaped curve of the older and the younger generations feeling lonelier. Women are lonelier than men. However, they do seek out help and use resources to overcome their loneliness compared to their male counterparts. And then socioeconomic status plays a big role as well. Higher income individuals are less lonely than those with lower incomes. Next slide, please. Looking at statistics about how our identities play a role, we found that LGBTQ plus individuals may be at a higher risk for loneliness due to discrimination, stigma, and they may face from like the society in general, but even from family members. And Black Americans report feeling lonely more often than white Americans, with 44% of Black adults reporting feelings of loneliness compared with 37% of white adults. Hispanic or Latino individuals have higher rates of loneliness than non-Hispanic whites. And like here, there's a higher risk factor that are language barriers, discrimination, and a lot of lack of social support that can play a huge role. And Asian Americans who reported experienced discrimination, especially in the recent past, were more likely to report feeling loneliness. Next slide. But loneliness doesn't merely make us feel bad. It actually takes a toll on our health. Loneliness can increase the risk of premature death by up to 50%. It has even been compared to be as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness can lead to high blood pressure, stroke, and heart disease. Loneliness doubles the risk of type 2 diabetes, decreases immune function, and raises the likelihood of dementia by 40%. So it has real physical implications when we feel lonely. Next slide, please. The late neuroscientist John Cacioppo theorized that loneliness might be actually an evolved adaptation. So just as feeling hungry or hunger motivates us to eat, loneliness is actually existing to drive us to seek out social contact. So you could consider this that loneliness is a mechanism that's in place because we need it as a social species. We needed to be able to identify when our connections with others for mutual aid or protection are being threatened or possibly absent. So if there's no connection, there could be mortal consequences for us as a species. People suffering from chronic loneliness are not irretrievably locked into these feelings, though, by nature or nurture. Studies have shown that cognitive therapies can be effective at reducing loneliness by training people to recognize how their behaviors and thought patterns hinder them from forming the kind of connections that they value. The researcher, Dr. Bzdok, and his team showed that some regions of the default network are changed in chronically lonely people, and that the number of connections to other parts of the brain have increased. So the default network, which only has been known for like the last 15 to 20 years, seem to be involved in distinctive abilities, such as language, anticipating the future, and causal reasoning. So really higher magnitude functions. But more generally, the default networks activates when we think about other people, and including when we interpret their intentions. And that plays a really big role when we talk about loneliness and how we perceive others when we are lonely. Next slide, please. From a psychological standpoint, loneliness is intrinsically linked with mental health. Several studies have shown that loneliness can contribute to various mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, as well as cognitive decline. And if you remember, like about 40% of people that are lonely are more likely to develop dementia. Chronic loneliness can lead to a persistent feeling of threat, like we are hypervigilant if there's any social threat around us, and it can contribute to an array of negative health outcomes, including, for example, sleep disturbances. And when we don't sleep, we don't feel really good, and then that sort of puts in like that domino effect. And people who feel lonely over extensive periods of time are likely to view others with more caution, and I said vigilance and defensiveness, and that is because of the fear of being left alone, which further could compound feelings of loneliness. So it is important to say that the data that we are actually sharing here today is not specific to any special population. Loneliness is for sure an individualized feeling, and we need to account for what it is making us lonely and what makes us feel lonely. What is working for one person may not apply for another person, and who is, for example, on the neurodiverse spectrum, or for someone who has history of trauma, other things might work. So it's really important that we consider that everybody will need to work things out for themselves. And you might need help with that. You might need therapy or other ways of dealing with the situation. But we want to make sure that you're aware of that since we're talking about it. Next slide, please. So we really want to look at loneliness also in the age of connectivity. The social media use is associated with increased feelings of loneliness and depression. And that is despite that we are living in a hyper-connected area, loneliness is more prevalent than ever. So we go online to escape our lonely feeling or feeling lonely, but many times it makes us feeling even worse. We think we relate to people and know them, but in reality, we only have this parasocial relationship with, for example, celebrities or influencers who do not even know that we exist. We think we know them really well, but they don't even know we are here. And there are so many traps that are created or create this unhealthy online relationship. And that could be, you could get bullied online, and that will cause even more isolation and increase the feeling of loneliness for the person who is at the receiving end. So if we look from the outside, social media has its benefits, absolutely. However, when you look closer, you can also see that many of the platforms want to keep you alone. They so you come back, right? So that you come back and you spend more time on any of the platforms. So you see all the advertisement and all these other things that they make money with. So it's clearly not our fault or your fault when you spend hours on social media, and I do that too. I think we all do. But it is important that we need to learn how to sort of game the system and use it to our advantage and rather than our detriment. So we can use it to connect with our real life friends and see what they're doing. And we can maybe find spaces through the medium to meet in person with our friends. And we can share happy moments that everybody can feel good about. And those are really important things. But I think at the end, it's really important to emphasize that the digital communication cannot replace the psychological benefits that we experience when we meet face to face and interact. So now we've given you a lot of background and talked a lot about loneliness and more general risk factors. Now I want to bring it in and acknowledge and validate that we have very unique set of risk factors for loneliness when it comes to biomedical researchers, that we can address individually, but also as a community. And here are some example reports that make us really wonder about how does loneliness look for researchers in the biomedical field. And for example, a UK study found that almost half of the researchers in university settings feel lonely at work. About 40% of academics have reported that isolation at work was the main factor affecting their mental health. And lastly, a longitudinal study found that early career academics felt geographically isolated as well as socially isolated. And so now I want to pass it on to my colleague, Erica, and she will talk a bit more about these specific risk factors that we can do as a person or collectively. Sorry, we will talk about the specific risk factors that we actually encounter as a scientist. And then what can we do as a person or collectively to turn around the wheel and connect and feel less lonely and isolated?
Thank you so much, Uli, for giving us that backdrop. And now I am going to talk a little bit more about the specific risk factors that may be unique to the biomedical research community and experience. And as I present these risk factors, I think it's important to note where there may be potential opportunities to intervene or areas of one's life to be especially mindful of and attentive to as you navigate training and also a career in biomedical research. So when I think of aspects of loneliness, I think of what could be the opposite of loneliness. And partnership, friendship, and closeness certainly establishes a sense of belonging and connectedness. And we know that based on the experience of a lot of biomedical researchers, that there are certain things that are intrinsic to the experience of training and the career that may make this kind of connectedness challenging. So for example, the constant change of geographic location, right? So you go to graduate school in one state, and then you have to do perhaps a postdoc in another state or do more research in another state. And then you have to compete for jobs all over the country or maybe globally. And so there's a lot of changing in geography and moving around within short periods of time, which may make it a bit more difficult for one to establish close friendships and partnerships and to maintain them. Also, even on the job, so developing relationships and friendships on the job may be more challenging because we're also experiencing, or biomedical researchers are also experiencing their research group mates or colleagues often sort of having transient careers. So they may also have to move away for work and for research purposes. There's also an extensive time in training. So pursuing a graduate degree and then pursuing a postdoctoral fellowship can take many years. And so that extensive time in training can sometimes make us feel as though perhaps the people that we went to college with or high school with are kind of leaving us even existentially because they may be moving on into other parts of their lives and developing their lives in ways that maybe it may be hard for biomedical researchers to do while you're still in training. And then literally the long hours spent working alone can contribute to feelings of loneliness. And so, as I said, these are things that may be intrinsic to the career path and to the experience of biomedical researchers. But I also want to think in a more optimistic way of thinking about, so then what may you need to be more attuned to in your life or pay more attention to, or what could be opportunities for intervention and for change? Other risk factors have to do with challenges to affinity, belonging, and connectedness. So as the biomedical research field diversifies and there's more attention paid to being inclusive, still people may experience being the quote unquote only in their research group, labs, or work environments. And you can be the only with regards to your gender, identity, ethnicity, race, and ability. Also, too, the biomedical research field is pretty global. And so often people are moving from other countries to the US, for example, where they may be more accustomed to different kinds of cultural expressions. So moving from an independent individual culture to an interdependent collective culture or vice versa. The Western world tends to be more independent and individual in nature. And so someone who's more accustomed to being from a more interdependent collective culture may automatically find just some of the ways in which people connect or don't connect, for example, in their research lab, that may contribute to loneliness, right? So if, for example, you're accustomed to people really attending to lunch times, and that being a time of gathering and social connectedness and spending more time outside of work, and it's not the case here, then that may be a difference that's felt, and that may be a difference that contributes to feelings of loneliness. In general, the hierarchical structure of the scientific field can be lonely at times. I'm thinking about perhaps people in leadership positions, especially PIs, mentors, supervisors, directors, right, who may long for more connection with colleagues, but just the nature of the work makes it so that it might be difficult. And also, too, the responsibility of perhaps being in a leadership position. So whereas people who work for you may be looking to you for guidance and for supervision, you might question, well, where can I find that? And you may have to be even more intentional about finding peers and mentors for you as a leader. There are also, I know, concerns about maintaining propriety of research, which can be, a reality, a concern for people where someone may want to share ideas with another colleague, but there's always the concern that, what if this person publishes this information first, publishes this content first, and then what does that mean for my career? And then lastly, work schedule changes due to the pandemic. So the pandemic, often people started working from home out of necessity, and we're still getting back to in-person work schedules gradually. However, what this means is that, offices are less populated. And so just automatically, you might be in the office with just a few people, whereas prior to the pandemic, there were just more people and more opportunities to socialize within the office. So also there may be challenges to feeling validated and supported. Again, these might be aspects that are intrinsic to the biomedical research field. However, in looking at these, I think it's important to think about where could there be some shifts? Where could there be opportunities for modification? So oftentimes the biomedical research field has a publish or perish culture in many research fields. And so at times it's hard to think about what's valuable apart from publishing a manuscript, for example. Automatically in training and also in working and in positions, there can be a culture of critique. So even though mentors and supervisors, may have positive comments to say about one's work, there may be sort of an efficiency in their guidance, and so maybe they're just focusing on what may not be right with your research or the science and just focusing on what needs to be corrected. And even though there may be kind of a rational understanding that this is the case, sometimes that can lead to feeling like you're not validated and not supported, and you might question what is the value that I'm bringing to the table in this organization. Also, as I said before, with the publish or perish culture, there can be a narrow perception of valuable contributions, right? So thinking only about manuscripts, publications as high value, and not necessarily thinking about perhaps all that goes into publishing a manuscript, everyone who's contributed and all this, even the small contributions. And sometimes this can cause a hesitance to communicating with mentors. In a culture of critique, in a culture of publish or perish, we might be less willing to admit when we need help, when we need guidance, when we're feeling vulnerable. And then also finding and competing for funding, right? So for example, needing to find your own funding through grants and fellowships. This might cause you to have to automatically compete with colleagues or peers, etc. And so all of this might lead to a feeling of being sort of on the periphery, a feeling like you may be alone in your journey and in your struggle. And so, like I said, even though some of these things are intrinsic to the biomedical research field, I think it's helpful to think about, well, what could be some shifts, or what might I need to be more attentive to or mindful of in my life to counterbalance some of these challenges and risk factors. Research shows that there are actually protective factors when it comes to either people feeling lonely or preventing people from feeling lonely. And as Uli said, the experience of loneliness is quite subjective, so I want you to keep that in mind. But research shows that people who report feeling less lonely are more likely to report higher levels of the following. So they're more likely to report feeling as though they have more ease being emotionally regulated. And that means basically that when someone experiences emotions, especially distress or stress or vulnerable emotions, that they may feel as though they can handle them in such a way where they don't feel as though they're drowning or overtaken by them. Research also shows that people who tend to report having higher levels of insight and self-awareness report feeling less lonely. Self-compassion, so that would be one's ability to empathize and treat others and yourself kind of with a certain understanding and patience and kindness and empathy. And then also a tolerance for diverse viewpoints and the experience and identities of others. So people who reported being genuinely interested in difference in terms of other people's cultures, other people's ways of life, other people's perspectives and viewpoints tended to report feeling less lonely. And then overall, people who report feeling more resilient in life or being more resilient in life tend to feel less lonely. And it's hard to know what the actual association is. So for example, hard to know whether people who are less lonely and more connected actually sort of feel better in general and therefore are better able to emotionally regulate, are better able to feel compassion for themselves and others, etc. Or if in fact these are sort of aspects of oneself and personality and skills that actually help to protect against feelings of loneliness if there are times in one's life when you may be less connected than other times. But I actually think that that doesn't matter, actually, in a way. I think what's most important here is to know that these are actually skills that can be strengthened over time and with support and with attention. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So as Uli said earlier, feeling lonely is actually an adaptive trait, especially in the short term. And just like hunger or thirst, just like when we feel hungry, it's leading us to know that we need to eat, we need nutrition. Feeling lonely can be an indicator or an adaptive data point that we need to connect. And so these are different ways in which one might think about their social circles and how connected they are. And I think it's important to remember that it's not necessarily about the quantity of your relationships. It's not about how many people you know, how many friends you have, how many social events you go to. Actually, research shows that it's actually more about the quality of these relationships. And so again, in looking at the different ways that we might connect, I think it's important to think about, even if you may feel as though you fall short on these ways of connecting, I think it's important to think about opportunities for growth, opportunities to deepen relationships, and opportunities to sort of widen your circle if necessary, based on your subjectivity, right? So based on the ways in which you find fulfilling to connect, as Uli said earlier. So one way first of thinking about connectedness and belonging is your inner circle. And so these are your close confidants. These are people in your life who you trust, who you feel psychologically safe with, who you can be vulnerable with and open with, right? When you maybe are feeling distressed, you feel as though you can go to them when you're upset and you can feel safe and they can offer support and care. And this could be a range of different kinds of relationships. Some people might think of a sibling or a spouse or a best friend as somebody who would be in your inner close circle. The other circle is the middle circle. And this could be a wider circle of family, friends, and acquaintances. And these are relationships or people who you share good times with, thinking about celebrating milestones, going to birthday parties, sharing meals with. These are also people that when you need to, you can reach out to them for support. This could be family, friends, acquaintances, and also mentors, also mentors that you have connected with along the way. And so again, it's not necessarily how large is this middle circle or how many people are in the middle circle, but do you have people in your life who you can share good times with, who you can reach out to for support? And then there's the outer circle, and this is collective connectedness. So this is more about our identities in terms of community. So this is coming together as a community or a group. It could be formal or informal, but what's most important to think about is coming together through shared interest and a shared purpose, oftentimes maybe shared values or shared things that may be important to you. And again, this can be flexible. So this could be a sports team that you might be on. This could mean perhaps a social organization that you're a part of that means a lot to you. This could mean a community of volunteering and service-oriented people that you connect with often or from time to time. So again, it's your larger circle of a community or group that you're a part of. It could even be taking a class. Maybe you take a regular yoga class and the people within that class, come again and again, and you notice that you sort of are forming a community together. So again, these are opportunities to think about in terms of opportunities for growth. How might you deepen some of your more interpersonal relationships? How might you maybe think about your middle circle and think about, do I need to connect more with people who are in my middle circle? Do I need to have more good times with them? And then there's joining. Might you have an interest or a hobby that you would like to explore more and with people gathering together? So the most important relationship, and one that has been shown to also help motivate people to connect with others, is your relationship to yourself. And there are many aspects of the self and your relationship to but I will go through some of the earlier concepts that I talked about earlier that have been shown to be protective, in either protecting against intense feelings of loneliness or either helping us to actually be motivated to connect to others and strengthen our sense of belongingness. So strengthening your emotion regulation can be so key in helping you to feel more stable and calm and at peace within yourself. And so this could be being able to label your emotions and feelings, noticing when you're feeling underwhelmed. So that might be shut down, exhausted, hopeless, depressed, or overwhelmed. So noticing how you feel internally, even when you are feeling certain emotions and feelings. Noticing when you might be feeling overwhelmed, so anxious, angry, or panicked. And responding to those emotions with acceptance and care. Sometimes even subconsciously, we have a tendency to shame and blame or judge ourselves when we're feeling in distress or when we're feeling more vulnerable feelings. And research has shown that sitting with your emotions starts with accepting them as they are and as they're coming up, even though they might be hard, and labeling them. Just by putting words to how you feel can sometimes lessen the intensity of the emotion, and responding to your emotions with a sense of compassion and curiosity as opposed to judgment and shame. And then engaging in relaxation techniques can help to soothe, can help to kind of take you out of that feeling of being underwhelmed or overwhelmed. So deep breathing, I think, it's very popular, but also very effective. It's something where you can breathe from your diaphragm. There are many, many different deep breathing techniques online, but focusing on your breath can almost immediately, depending on how anxious you are, but immediately or over time, help you to feel more stabilized, more soothed, more calm, and more relaxed and more grounded. Regular exercise. So we know that given what exercise does for brain chemistry, we know that it can help you to feel much less anxious and much less depressed, especially over time and with a regular exercise routine. Engaging in creative activities or enjoyable hobbies. So this is sort of like, playing as an adult, right? We often used to play as children, but, playing as an adult is really important in that thinking about things that you're passionate about, that you might really like to do, or that you might want to try. And then that gives you not only a sense of enjoyment and fun, but it could also give you a sense of mastery, something a bit different than your work. And then reaching out to others for help. So maybe thinking about the circles of connection currently that are in your life, thinking about who you might reach out to for support when you might be feeling sort of a bit distressed or anxious or more vulnerable. And if those circles seem really small, maybe thinking about that's okay. Maybe thinking about, might you need to be in contact more with the person? So it's not about quantity, it's more so about the quality of their relationships. Other ways in which you might think about strengthening your relationship with yourself so that you might be able to sort of feel a little bit less lonely or feel the feelings of loneliness less intensely, and then you might be more motivated to connect, are cultivating self-awareness and insight and strengthening self-compassion. And I realize that this can be quite challenging. It can be really challenging to take a deep dive in analyzing yourself and sitting with yourself. So this is not something to think about achieving quickly. This is something to focus on over time. It's a process that sometimes requires our own patience and also help. And we'll talk a little bit about therapy in a bit, but people may need support in helping themselves, in helping to strengthen their relationship with themselves. So cultivating self-awareness and insight can be important, right? So just observing, for example, how your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are connected, reflecting on how your personal history informs your present experience. So you may have heard the term nature and nurture, right? So oftentimes we may be born and predisposed to a certain subjectivity, but also how we were treated as children, what our family dynamics were like, what our history of experiences have been, all form our relationships to ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, how we react to stress and distress. Reflective journaling can be helpful in sort of thinking about this connection between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There's a UCLA loneliness scale. So when it comes to loneliness specifically, there's actually a scale that everyone can take online, where if you're thinking about, if you're thinking about, well, how lonely am I? You might want to take that, and that could be a stepping stone to get you started in terms of how you want to respond and intervene. And then strengthening self-compassion. I talked a little bit earlier about sometimes our tendency, even unconsciously or subconsciously, to shame and blame ourselves when we're feeling vulnerable, when we're feeling distressed. Because sometimes we might come from environments or families where being independent and going at it on your own was prized. But we all know that, we live life together, as this whole presentation emphasizes. So it can be sometimes hard to have compassion for yourself when you're in a more vulnerable state. But first and foremost, comforting your body and attending to your physical health is important. Responding to yourself with curiosity, kindness, and acceptance, as I implied earlier. Actually practicing gratitude can actually help you to feel a bit more compassion and more at peace with yourself. So even thinking about what you may be grateful for, even if it's little things, right? Maybe you're grateful for the sun being out today versus it raining, but capturing that and being mindful and really reflecting on that can actually help you feel more self-compassion and more inner peace. And then practicing mindful meditation. So mindful meditation is, a popular term. And there's so many apps, there's so many self-help books that can help to start your practice of being more present and being more mindful. And using meditation to help to strengthen your sense of self-compassion. And like I said, I know that this is not easy, and it's not something that you have to do all of this right away. It may be helpful to think about maybe one or two things that you could try, but I think it's important to think about how you engage in it. And so engaging in it with patience, thinking about it as a journey and a process versus one single destination, I think can be helpful. I think it's also important to note that, as we talk about maybe shifting or modifying, deepening our relationships or kind of increasing our social circles, sometimes it's helpful to think about, well, what are our current social circles? And, what are the relationships that currently exist in our lives that could maybe actually be deepened or could maybe be modified in a way that helps us to feel more connected and less lonely. And so I think about how we work so much of the time. Most people spend so much time at work, so much time with their colleagues. And so thinking about how might you connect differently with your colleagues? How might you connect differently at your institution? So taking some of the insight today and applying it to practice at your institutions. So research has shown that positive relationships at work have a significant impact on employee engagement, professional development, productivity, and even innovation. When people feel good about not only where they work, but who they're around and who they're working with, and they feel sort of seen, heard, and understood by their fellow colleagues and by their supervisors, it actually helps the work. And in this case, helps the science. So first, how might you think about cultivating affinity, belonging, and connectedness at your institution? This doesn't necessarily have to take a lot of time or a lot of time away from work. You might think about what are some simple ways to create opportunities for socializing and sharing apart from work meetings or work content. I think about some of the things that have been done here in the OITE office, taking, special days of the year and using that as a theme or backdrop to, invite people to socialize outside of their labs, outside of their research groups, like Popsicle Day, for example, or the Leaping Into Community event that we had, where we used the February's Leap Day as kind of a theme to help people socialize. Finding even brief and spontaneous moments to interact with colleagues, expressing care and support. So this could be as simple as, meeting at the water cooler informally, maybe before the workday begins, if you tend to arrive early at work, and having, casual conversations, asking people about how their weekends were, asking people about what their plans may be for vacation, etc. And then forming and joining, so maybe forming even different affinity groups at your institution based on your identity, based on your interest. We have several here at NIH, affinity groups based on ethnicity, based on ability, sexuality, etc. And so that could be just another way of connecting beyond the work. And then forming clubs or groups based on shared interest. I'm thinking about the a cappella group here at NIH, people who may have been in a cappella groups when they were in college, who still want to continue that. For example, I think I've heard that there's like a band or maybe even like an orchestra here at NIH as well, of NIH colleagues or NIH trainees. So you can get creative with it. But the point is to perhaps think about who you are as a person beyond the work, what your interests may be, and how you might use that to connect with other people. And if you're in a leadership position, maybe thinking about how you might model or, how you might shift the culture within your department or work group in such a way that encourages connectedness and belonging. And then cultivating validation and support. As I said earlier, sometimes just the nature of biomedical research can create a culture of critique or a culture of publish or perish, where it's hard to feel validated and supported. But might there be a way to respond to that? Might there be a way to shift a bit? And so thinking about even small ways to celebrate a range of accomplishments and all those who contributed. It could be as simple as an email, acknowledging an event that happened and thanking everybody who was a part of that event. Reflecting on, I think this could be another point where reflection and analysis is helpful, right? So reflecting on, whether your system is a climate where staff can feel comfortable asking for guidance and help, or whether it's a place, maybe, of course, not intentionally, but unintentionally, is there a climate where people feel a bit intimidated to ask for what they need? And then creating opportunities for more collaboration and more mentorship. So if people feel more intimidated to ask for help, might there be other ways besides just speaking to one's mentor or supervisor? Might there be some informal or even formal ways of kind of cultivating peer mentorship with each other? And then, as Uli said earlier, and I said earlier, we want to acknowledge, the sort of the spectrum of experience and the spectrum of presentation. And so, I think about, I'm a psychotherapist, and that's my background. And I think about the many people who I've treated or seen who have had experiences in their lives, such as trauma or complex trauma, which can really affect how we connect. It can affect how safe we feel in connecting with others, or it can affect sort of that maybe things don't feel enough. Maybe the relationships that one has doesn't quite fill the void of the loneliness that we may feel and despair. And in that case, I think therapy can be so helpful in for many reasons. And basically, research has shown that psychotherapy can reduce feelings of loneliness and social isolation. As Uli said earlier, CBT therapies, there's evidence to show that CBT therapies can have that effect, as well as some person-centered therapies. There's some trauma-focused therapies that can really reduce feelings associated with trauma and can help people kind of broaden what's called their window of tolerance, which probably in the end has a secondary gain of helping people feel more stabilized so that they can actually connect with other people in a more healthy way. And so there are all kinds of therapies. There's individual therapy and there's group therapy. So individual therapy, just briefly, can offer insights into how one's past informs the present. It can help with reframing negative thought patterns. So, especially people who have been lonely over extensive periods of time or chronic loneliness, as Uli said, basically can feel as though the world might not be for them, so to speak, or can feel as though they can feel more cautious and more defensive automatically when thinking about connecting socially, because loneliness over time can have that impact. And so research has shown that reframing thoughts, helping people to reframe how they are perceiving others can be really helpful. And then the therapeutic aspect of the individual therapy relationship in and of itself can be a corrective experience. So that would include trust, safety, positive regard, and just an optimistic stance that actually change is possible. There's also group therapy and support groups for specific issues. So support groups can provide a sense of universality, support, often reduction in feeling alone, and an opportunity to speak and be heard. So an opportunity to be seen, heard, and understood. And then also one can experience empathy and communication in relationships. And one thing I think that Uli mentioned, but I do want to also drive home is that, being connected is not one-sided. And actually to get the most benefit of being connected, it has to be sort of an exchange and reciprocity and more of a dynamic. And research has shown that just receiving care and concern actually doesn't quite tend to soothe or manage loneliness feelings. There has to be sort of more of an exchange where not only are you receiving support, but you also have an opportunity to give support to the person that you're in the relationship with. So lastly, I just want to go over some of the ongoing programming and events that we have. So Becoming a Resilient Scientist, it's a 5-lecture series, including, and also small group discussions are included. It can be an introduction to wellness and resilience, understanding distorted self-talk and imposter fears, self-advocacy and assertiveness in the workplace, developing feedback resilience, and mentoring and managing up. And even though the word loneliness is not included in these titles, I would say, some of the skills that that are included in these series can really help, I think, with one's relationship to themselves, and therefore kind of indirectly, I think, probably help people connect. There's also Raising a Resilient Scientist, which discusses empathic communication, as we talked about, so important to a sense of a feeling of belongingness and connectedness, and supporting trainees around that. How we might cultivate belonging in an inclusive research group, and then overall promoting trainee mental health and well-being. So far we have had talks on burnout, healthy rest, and today the epidemic of loneliness. And then next month, please look out for the talk on supporting each other in our well-being. That will likely be a panel discussion, and it'll be on Thursday, the 26th at 4 p.m. And then there's a host of videos on the NIH OITE YouTube channel that all have to do with well-being, and probably touch on a lot of the ways of being well that we talked about today. So I want to thank you very much and for listening, and I hope that this was informative and helpful. And now we will take questions.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A box and one in the chat. So somebody mentions that they feel lonely when they're not invited by, like colleagues to any kind of event. But then actually when they get invited and they're actually going, they're kind of bored. And because people are talking about things that the person cannot connect to in terms of like family or having a house or something which they don't have. What would be something that they could do?
Yeah, that's a good question. It sort of sounds like a both and, right? Like I feel lonely when I'm not invited, but then when I actually when I am invited, I find myself maybe feeling on the periphery. So I first think about you know, maybe finding a couple people at your job who you might connect with, and maybe think about steering the conversation to perhaps offer or your interest, maybe being a bit more open about your interest, and what's important to you, and seeing where that might go in the conversation. Sometimes that can be like a conversation starter. I think, when it comes to feeling not invited, I think that is probably a feeling of, you do become lonely, and feeling excluded can very much, as we talked about, make you feel lonely. I wonder about, it sounds like you are sometimes invited. So I wonder about perhaps maybe, thinking about asserting yourself. For example, if there is a gathering that you really want to go to, but you weren't invited, maybe think about asking whomever is organizing the gathering to maybe to see if you could possibly come or go. Sometimes I think it can be helpful to be aware too of maybe how you're interpreting the not being invited. Sometimes in a workplace, while sometimes people feel excluded, it may not be intentional. There may be the intention may be more quote unquote benign. There's something called benign intent in kind of in therapy and in psychotherapy that can actually help to kind of reduce your feelings of being offended, or being sort of frustrated by the not being invited, and thinking about maybe other reasons why it could have been that you might have been overlooked, and seeing if it feels safe enough for you to assert yourself and assert that you would like to go to that particular event. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Thank you, Erica. Somebody else put in the chat that usually loneliness leads to fewer activities, which then in turn could lead to laziness. But here it is evident that you get out of the loneliness. To get out of loneliness, one actually needs to be active. How do you break that paradox?
Mm-hmm. Another good question. I I think about first thinking about yourself and thinking about, what you like to do. What are your interests? What are your passions? Is there something that you want to try? Just noticing as you think about that, is there something that actually helps you to feel a bit more motivated or a bit more energized around it? Um, Sometimes we have to kind of behaviorally activate, which can build its own motivation. So starting small, maybe thinking about, I have a goal today of taking a walk in a park, for example, or something small. And even just starting with that, kind of activating yourself can kind of help to build the motivation to maybe do more. It may surprise you, but oftentimes, action can actually beget motivation and more energy. And it's okay to maybe start small. But nonetheless, just thinking of like, what can I do, even if it's small? What may be something novel that I want to try? Maybe that could help with motivation and energy. Or what am I passionate about? What am I interested in? Could be a way to start. And sometimes, laziness can also be a sign that you might feel more sad and more kind of underwhelmed, as I talked about earlier. And so you might want to attend to that. You might want to think about sort of what could your word laziness be associated with? What feelings might it be associated with?
Thanks so much. I really love that some people posted some options of what you could do to be less lonely. We have the suggestion for doing some contra dancing in Glen Echo, which is pretty awesome. And somebody said, why not throw a pizza party and invite lots of people? Even if they don't know you, they might come for the pizza and then you get to know them. So I think those are wonderful suggestions. And since there's another question. No, so since we have all the questions answered and we are on the hour, I would thank you again for joining us today. We hope that we could show you a little bit how especially loneliness for biomedical researchers is actually a big topic, and that there are so many risk factors that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And we hope that we were able to show you a little bit of what you can do and what your institution with you can do to relieve some of these risk factors and create a more supportive environment that we can all thrive in. So with that, I thank you. I wish you a great rest of Wednesday afternoon, and we hope to see you soon in June when we talk about how we can support others and can be well together. So with that, as I said, have a lovely afternoon and goodbye.